Coming up on today's episode of the Salesman Podcast.
My philosophy is always the first thing you want to do is just imitate an existing sales process until you feel comfortable with it. After you've imitated that, then you can start to integrate different sales processes or different things into the existing sales process before you then move to innovating. And that's where you create your own sales process.
Hello, Sales Nation, and welcome to today's episode of the Salesman Podcast, the world's most listened to B2B sales show. If you haven't already, make sure to click subscribe. And with that, let's meet today's guest.
Well, my name is John Crowley, and I help sales professionals develop a brand so that they can control their careers. And I also help sales organizations reorganize so that they can create sales systems that are scalable.
On this episode of the show with John, we're diving into why sales processes suck, or why some of them suck anyway. We're diving into John's 3-step sales process, which makes total sense, adds a ton of value to the buyer, and will hopefully progress you through the sales cycle even quicker than your usual 15-step process that you've got in your CRM, which is clunky, horrible, and outdated. We dive into a whole lot more towards the end of the show. We go off the rails, and John brings it back in for us. And so let's jump right in. We want to talk about why sales process potentially sucks, and we can perhaps debate this or go back and forth on it a little bit. But before we dive into the issues of having a sales process, implementing it, trying to stick along with it for as long as possible, and it actually being successful or not, why do we need a sales process, if at all, in the first place?
Well, I think we definitely need a sales process. Well, there's no doubt about that. But where the complexity lies, and the reason I say this is because I spend a lot of my free time mentoring young sales professionals. And as we're talking through, what I find out is that many of them neglect to implement their existing sales process, the one that their company has given them. But they're hungry and they're going out, reading books, listening to podcasts like this. They get different tips and hacks and tricks, and they try to integrate those into their existing sales process. So it's not that sales processes stink. It's when you have two competing sales processes laid on top of each other that there becomes complexity and confusion within the whole system.
Well, you took my language here because I've done exactly this. And in hindsight, what I was doing was taking the bit out of the process that I didn't like doing, which was knocking on hospital operating room or theatre doors and sticking my head in like, hi, get out. I was trying to avoid doing that by implementing social selling, or it wasn't really social selling when I was doing medical device sales, but whatever that's kind of turned into. I was trying to avoid the hard stuff and replace it with the seemingly easy stuff. And it kind of had somewhat of a mixed success. So with that said, if someone has, they start a job, they're given, this is our formal sales process, should we just stick to that blindly? And if we should, is there a period of time where we should stick to it and then start experimenting?
Yes. My philosophy is always the first thing you want to do is just imitate an existing sales process until you feel comfortable with it. After you've imitated that, then you can start to integrate different sales processes or different things into the existing sales process before you then move to innovating. And that's where you create your own sales process. But you've got to take a step back. As I've talked to sales professionals, what I constantly hear is their frustration is, I'll ask them, how do you segment your customers? And I get silence. Or I'll ask them, what is your quota or your goal? And it's crickets, Will. I don't hear anything. And the point is that they completely miss over the foundation, the most important building blocks that you build your sales process upon. And that causes a lot of confusion. And that's where I think the confusion lies.
Okay, so you've touched on something here. We have to dive a little bit deep into it. What are the foundational elements of a sales process? Because you mentioned, well, if you were to ask me that question, I'd be, well, kind of prospecting, qualifying, and all the usual jabba jabba that we've been talking about for the past 50 years, 100 years in sales. But you mentioned two things then that perhaps aren't implemented as often as what they should be, of segmentation and perhaps goal setting. So what are the key foundation or fundamentals that we should be focusing on? Say perhaps we haven't been given any kind of process and we've just been kicked out the door with a quota.
Yeah, so I think the first, it goes into planning, and you've got to spend a lot of time planning. But once you get past the planning phase, there's really three main steps. It's why change. You've got to find a reason you have to give the buyer a reason to change. Why me? So why you've got to use my product versus my competition. And then the last piece of that sales stage is why now? giving them some sort of time constraints that binds them to make a decision in the near future. That to me is the basic sales process upon which you can build everything else on.
Is this, because I was going to ask you about this, and I feel like we're tying it together already. You're taking the words out of my mouth, and tell me if I'm totally wrong. I'm on the wrong track of it. But I was going to ask you about the sales process, this formal thing that we, seemingly stereotypical aggressive salespeople push people down, versus the buying process, which is this seemingly nice, fluffy thing which is used to manipulate salespeople and get discounts. But why change? Why me? Why now? Seems to skew more towards what the buyer wants rather than what we put in a CRM. Is that the angle that we should be taking with all of this?
I believe so. I fundamentally believe that we have to map our sales process to the buyer's journey. And of course, there's going to be times where you want to kind of bring them down a certain path. But if you're radically trying to change the way that they go about understanding and coming to a conclusion, you're going to end up butting your heads against the buyer as opposed to walking right beside him and her down this path together. I can't stress enough the importance of really mapping out the buying process first and then aligning your sales process to the buyer's journey.
So if we're doing this and we're mapping out, we're putting a bit of planning work in, how do we segment a series of customers, and how do we find out what they want from us, how we can help them change, perhaps before we get on the phone with them? How do we make some hypotheses about this before we then kind of make assumptions and see if our assumptions are correct?
Yeah, again, it goes back to that beginning, the basis of the sales process. It's doing some social studying, which is going online and trying to see, is this particular buyer talking about making changes? Are they online asking other people questions? It's trying to get into their shoes. And, think back to, I don't know how long you've been out of the medical device world, but I remember when I first got into pharmaceutical sales, the only lens that you had into the buyer's journey was walking into their office and trying to get in front of them in their office space. Nowadays, there's so much information that is free that's sitting out there, whether it be on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. I mean, there's so many different channels that you can tap into to see, is this person on a buying journey, or have they not even gone down that path? Are they completely content with their existing solution, which 9 times out of 10, that probably is it. They're happy with what they have today and they're not looking to make a change. So it's your job to get in front of them and talk about why they need to make that change today.
And I know for me, it's funny you should mention this, and I wasn't planning on bringing this up, but I will, because it's top of mind at the moment. This week, we're putting together a social engineering workshop here in the Sales School, salesschool.org. And the premise of social engineering is typically from a bad place of, it's difficult to hack into somewhere, but it's very easy to drop a USB key in a car park that says wages or top secret documentation or something. The receptionist, whoever, puts it in the computer, and they kind of break into different systems that way. You can also do it by ringing people, pretending to be people that you're not, and gather information on that front. Mm-hmm. So there's this whole world of social engineering, and people are being social engineered all the time. They don't realize it. So we're doing a workshop on the Sales School, how to do this from a good place. And it brought up an example that I had, and I've done it so many times in hindsight, but I didn't call it social engiering. I didn't really have a name for it. It was just me being inquisitive and chatting to people. But I'd go into a theatre, be meeting with a surgeon, we'd have a good chat. There was always open doors. I'm not trying to make out that I'm some kind of hero here. I've always worked for companies that have incredible brands, and so I always got into the theatres. There was no cold calling or anything like that. But one of the first things I'd do would be to walk over to one of the nursing staff and kind of whisper in his or her ear and just be like, what really pisses this surgeon off equipment-wise? What's going on behind the scenes that he won't show me or she won't show me, because they don't want to look stupid. They don't want to look like they don't know what they're doing, because I would have done a lot of the training on the equipment as well. And within 10 seconds, you'll have some boisterous, loud nurse bantering on about how this surgeon can't use this, does not use this, threw this equipment across the room because it wasn't sterilized properly, or it came back from sterilization broken, and all these kind of things. And there's just a ton of value, and kind of I'm ranting and going slightly off track here. There's a ton of value of why change, and potentially that leads into how I can help them change from just asking the simple question, right? And perhaps this isn't you going into hospital theatre speaking to a nursing staff, and this is the social engineering example. Perhaps this is just you calling up a manager next to the person that you're trying to engage with and saying, "What pisses off John every day? Why is he so mad all the time?" Is it as simple as that?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. And probably my favorite chapter in the book, and it's not my original idea. I stole this from one of my mentors, was learn the business and the dollars will follow. And I'll share with you kind of an anecdote. Many years ago, I was a sales rep and I was working in the world of distribution. So I had thousands of products that I was selling. Well, one of the companies came to us with a spiff to sell this one particular product. And I remember I picked up the phone and I called my mentor and I said, buddy, you got to explain to me, how do I go about doing this? And he walked me through exactly what it was that I needed to do to sell the heck out of this one particular, it was a pharmaceutical, a drug. And so I went out there and pounded the pavement and I annihilated this sales competition. But what was really interesting was right before I got off the phone with my mentor, he said to me this one thing. He goes, hey, buddy, just remember, this product isn't for everyone. And I was like, yeah, whatever, get off the phone. So I end up winning the sales competition. And I call my buddy, he's the first one to call me. He's like, congratulations. And what was interesting is I'm looking at the stack ranking and he's like middle of the road. And I'm like, you told me what to do. You're one of the best sales reps I've ever known in my entire life. How did you finish middle of the road? And he had this cool, laid back West Coast demeanor. And he goes, buddy, this product's not for everyone. So fast forward about 3 months, what ended up happening was that product that I sold was a brand new product and it didn't have reimbursement. In other words, the doctors that I sold it to, they could give it to the patient, but the insurance companies weren't paying for it. So I had 3 practices that had millions of dollars of inventory sitting on their shelves that they couldn't use because I tried to force this product down their throat. So yes, I won the spiff, but I ended up losing 3 customers. So I tell you that because that mentor of mine used to always tell me, learn the business and the dollars will follow. What he means by learn the business, learn your customer's business and the dollars, the commission will follow. And that is something that has stuck with me forever because there's very few, especially in the B2B world, people that you deal with that don't have their business in the front of their mind. If you can understand where they make money, where they lose money, where they are delighted, and where they're ticked off. If you can find out those 4 things, you can navigate, a sales process with that particular buyer. And most importantly, at the end of the day, you're actually adding value to that buyer.
I'm going to ask you how we do this in a second, but I'm going to give you a quick example. So I sell the advertising space on the podcast, have done for years. If I don't sell it, I don't eat. It's as simple as that. But recently we launched this product, the Sales School. I won't kind of bang on about it. This isn't an advert for it, but we're now advertising the Sales School in the podcast. So if there's any spur ad inventory, or I'm experimenting with 2 adverts per show as well. No one's complained. No one's said anything. And obviously that's instantly doubles my revenue for the organization, which is seemingly like a ridiculous thing a ridiculous thing to say and to kind of have highlighted to me, but no one's complained. People are still clicking on the ad, so assume people are happy with it. So that's a side note. But what I have discovered is how to describe this. I know podcast advertising works. I just go on industry standard numbers. I should be charging a lot more for it because it's so niche and it's so specific, and our audience, an affluent, kind of, mostly millennial, kind of high, how to describe it without using loads of marketing jargon, but essentially affluent, fast moving audience. But I've only ever used industry standard pricing, which goes across podcasts, which a science podcast, which has way more downloads, way bigger demographic, and so it's far harder to advertise to. So long story short, when I started advertising the Sales School, I realized, oh shit, I'm doing more from my own product than I am from anyone else's product, even though the margins on their products are higher and all these other things going alongside it. But when I start to eat my own dog food and start to understand my business even more by selling my own product and seeing the results from it, it made then selling it to other people far easier. So this is one thing for me to say, and it's, the success of the Sales School leads to other bigger projects down the line, which helps the audience. So it all kind of feeds back into this big flywheel and this big loop. But for people who can't sell their own product and experience the process of selling their own product, if that makes sense, how do we really understand what the customer needs? Because a lot of the time, they don't even know, right?
Yeah, so Will, I'm going to say something that you, coming from the medical background, probably have heard of before, but I think most people haven't. preceptorships. So in the world of healthcare, what we would do is we would do these preceptorships, which essentially was a lot of times it was the med school students would follow a physician around for a day, week, month, year, whatever it may be, and just shadow them. In the world of pharmaceutical sales and drug distribution, I was doing a lot of preceptorships too, where I would go and follow the physician, or even better yet, it would be the administrator, like the lead person, business person within a practice. And it's quietly following them around, observing their body language, what makes them happy, what makes them sad, not trying to sell a lick. It is not your job when you're doing this to sell anything. It is just to learn. And once you understand what it is that they value, what makes them happy, sad, what makes them money and what makes them losing money, that's how you start to create the value. So what you essentially did in advertising the sales school was you did your own internal preceptorship. And if we can get to a point where you say to a potential buyer, hey, would you mind if I shadow you or someone, a key decision maker in your business for a day or week to really understand? What I have found is whenever you do that, the people that you're asking to do the preceptorship, they immediately, their guard comes down and they go, okay, they welcome that because they want somebody who's going to sell them a product that has empathy for their current situation.
So what does that look like practically? Because it's one thing for us to say to the audience, if you're selling to doctors, go and hang out with some doctors. Is this approaching our best customers and just saying, hey, can I just spend half a work day with you, as opposed to kind of what we would typically do, maybe, which would be, can we go out for lunch, or can I take you here, or can we do some training on this? Or is it going out to new customers, so it doesn't really matter if they like you or they don't like you, and there's then the opportunity to perhaps close a deal on the end of it, even though you just said don't try and close a deal with them. So that kind of angle on this, how do we practically about this? And then I want to follow up with, how do we get our sales manager to sign off on this when we're not spending time in the office pounding the phones or running around like a headless chicken driving a BMW, chasing down doctors? Because clearly that's where they get their bonus from. So yeah, what does it look like to ask to get this in the book, in the diary, and then how do we sell it to our sales manager?
Yeah, I almost think you flip it. I think the first thing you have to do is sell it to your sales manager and get their sign off on it. Once they agree to it, I think you can go about one of two ways. You can either go to existing customers that you have a relationship with. The problem there is that they may not be totally honest with you. They may only show you the good things, or maybe they only show you the bad things. So I think you could do a mix of existing customers as well as new potential customers. But again, just like you guide people on this podcast, Will, you ask great questions. That's the purpose of this preceptorship. It is absolutely not to sell anything. It is strictly a learning observation or a learning opportunity where you step back after the preceptorship, and then you can start to say, okay, I can see how my product truly fits this customer. Or maybe you realize, hey, your product isn't the best fit at all, and you move on to something bigger and better. But then in the future, you've identified what are the key things that will keep you away from selling to one of these products. What are some of the objections that make a customer not a good fit for your product?
So we've covered, or touched on at least, because I'm sure we could do about 15 hours on this, John. John's selling process of why change, why me, and we'll come on to why now in a second, because I think this is where people get stuck. And I know I'm in the middle of, I don't know if I should say this because they listen to the show, but I'm in the middle of a deal that's kind of slowly coming in as we talk about this now. So I'll take some tips away from there. But before we get to that stage, how important... we're going to go off track here for a second, but I know you're into this and I'm into it as well, so it'll make sense. But when we're talking to people about why change, why me, how important is our personal brand? How important is it our credibility internally within our own organization, and perhaps credibility through having some kind of content, or maybe not following quote unquote kind of thought leadership, but some kind of online membership of some kind of community within our industry? How important is brand to the first couple of steps of the selling process?
Brand kind of falls into that same bucket as value to me, is that everybody talks about how important it is, but it's so unique to each individual person that's out there. I can't say enough the importance of brand. And I'll give you an example. Well, I was in a sales role and I ended up getting wrapped up in this wonderful non-compete issue, which forced me essentially out on the sidelines for a couple of years and I wasn't able to sell. And I spent 2 years creating the brand of your sales mentor. And what I was able to do during those 2 years was really create a thought leadership where people came to me and were asking me, how to develop sales people, how to develop sales organizations. Fast forward, I ended up getting a consulting gig with a company, and within 6 months, they promoted me into a vice president of sales and sales operations. So over the course of 3 years, I went from just being a bag carrying sales guy to the vice president of sales and sales operations for a Fortune 15 company. That never would have happened if it wasn't for the brand that I had developed. So the next question is, well, how do you go about developing that brand? And that's something that you've got to really spend a lot of time in crafting. What is your unique selling proposition? And that's a challenge. It takes a long time to come up with that. And it's done through iterations of constantly reworking and seeing what resonates and what doesn't, and adapting, adjusting your sales pitch. But getting back to your question, I think a brand is the most important thing that a sales rep can have these days, because that's the way the world is going. Everyone is going to have their brand. And you have one today, whether you realize it or not. The question is, do you control that brand messaging, or does somebody else control it for you?
How does that look in the corporate environment? You shared an example with me earlier, and I don't know if you want to share that kind of again, or whether kind of that was off the record or what. But if not, we can kind of go back and forth on it. But how does that look like if we say we are XYZ on a LinkedIn profile, on a website, whatever it is, and internally within our corporation, medical devices, conservative organizations, they want to be here for the kind of long term. They don't want anyone saying anything too exciting on a LinkedIn profile, for example. How does that translate into the corporate world, especially if you're working for Oracle, Salesforce, one of these huge organizations that perhaps have got their own brand ahead of your personal brand?
Yeah, I mean, I think your LinkedIn profile is your LinkedIn profile. Unless your company is paying you for a LinkedIn profile, it is 100% yours. Do you have to be radical and call yourself a knuckle-dragging salesperson? Maybe not. You could certainly develop a brand around thought leadership. My philosophy on brand has always been that different is better than better. What I mean by that is, if you try to keep up with the Joneses and do things a certain way, you're easily shadowed by somebody who comes in and just does it a little bit better. I would rather somebody who stands out because they're different. So getting back to your question, I think it's important that you don't alienate anyone within your organization, but at the same time, try to do things that make you stand out and be different than the crowd.
Love it. And I love the way, because a lot of people would not have said that. There's certain sales experts and quote unquote gurus and authors who kind of tread the other direction. But I think, and this is my personal opinion, I don't want to be sued for giving this and getting people sacked over time, but there's a line and you want to be treading up to that line, and you want to be kind of on the line leaning over. That's always my thought. The cliche saying, or the classic saying of, it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. I feel a lot of what we're talking about here kind of falls into, I'm not putting words in your mouth, this is my opinion, but I feel like a lot of what we're talking about falls into that kind of realm here. So moving on to the kind of final stage of John's incredible sales process here. And I do enjoy this. I'm not being sarcastic in that it is super simplified and it comes from the buyer's perspective. I know my British accent, people sometimes think I'm being sarcastic, John, and I'm truly not. Why now? How do we emphasize movement, and how do we get people kind of bubbling over with whether it's stress about the current situation, bubbled over enough that they get to the point where they take action? Because obviously there's a bump of energy needed to get anywhere on the other side of this. How do we implement the why now part of the selling process? How do we kind of just get things moving once we're all in agreement that now is the time, or there is a reason for change, and we are the individuals that can help catalyze that?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to the beginning of that sales process and your due diligence as you sit down the first time with that potential buyer, trying to understand what their timeline looks like. Look, if you try to force somebody into your timeline, it's the same thing as trying to force them into your sales process. It's eventually going to backfire, and you're certainly not going to create the collaboration that you would want. as if you would have set from the onset of the conversation the destination in which you're trying to go. So I think it's really important to understand what's the buyer trying to accomplish, when are they trying to accomplish it, and why are they trying to accomplish it in that time frame. If you identify that and map your sales process to that particular time frame, you're going to be in a much better situation than if you try to force them into, I've got my end of quarter numbers coming up, and I've got to get you to sign on the dotted line, when it just doesn't align at that point in time.
I was in a Ford dealership over the weekend, so recording this on a Monday. It was on a Saturday morning. Dad's got a Ford. It's got an oil leak, so he's taking it back in for like the 5th time to hopefully have this resolved. And I was laughing my head off. So I have a go at used car salespeople all the time on the podcast. And it's nothing personal. It's just a stereotype, just as probably they have a stereotype about us. Us schmucks walking around in our suits and nice watches, flogging stuff and seemingly working less hard than what they are. So it probably goes back and forth. But there was literally this dude on the end of the line, and the sales manager was shouting across the room, "It's the last day of the month. Get on it, come on." Like, he was trying to close this deal of a couple that had been in earlier on and were kind of umming and ahhing, and they were offering, I don't know, some kind of wheel. Like, if you curb your wheels, if you scratch your wheels, they'll replace them or repair them for free or something. And they were just throwing all this extra stuff at this seemingly it seemed like an older couple, just from the way that things were being, the conversation was going, just to get them to sign on the line, because clearly they were trying to push it over into that month so they all got the bonuses. So with that all said, is it as simple as that? Because I don't know the answer to this. Is it as simple as that, John, that the beginning of the conversation we say, when do you want to solve this problem? They say 6 months from now, and then we just keep teeing them up every few weeks and just allow the course to run at that pace? Or is there value in, if the customer has a problem, that we know that we can solve it, in accelerating that process and removing the pain from them quicker?
Look, if you have to change their time frame, just like the car salesman that you're talking about, that car salesman is going to have to take a price hit, right? They're going to have to offer something extra. I think if you want to walk away with a deal that is it's fair to both sides, where you're not offering incentives that are just thrown in there to speed it up, then yeah, you have to mirror what that buyer wants to do. But if their buying process doesn't align up with your sales journey, if you do want to get that closed within a certain time frame, you're probably going to have to offer concessions you wouldn't have to otherwise.
So with that all said, and we'll wrap up with this, there's going to be people listening now that go in, that sounds fantastic. This all makes total sense, right? It seems like my life's going to get a whole lot easier after this conversation, and things are going to be a lot more fluid. But I've got to close some deals before the end of the quarter, otherwise I won't be here next quarter. How do we align what we're saying here, which clearly is the correct pathway of going about things, of doing it on not necessarily the buyer's timeline, but going through their journey and helping them through it? And clearly you're going to be the vendor that they're going to choose if there's other vendors trying to throw discounts on them and hammer them on different things and try and leverage them into closing the deal quicker. You're going to win that deal over the long run on that front. But how do we balance that with, John, I've got to buy that Nissan GTR. I can't, if I don't hit my quota this quarter, I'm never going to be able to afford it. How do we balance the long-term approach, or the medium-term approach, I guess, versus just closing deals now because our sales manager's on our back?
Let's be honest. The reason we're getting the sales manager on our back is because we didn't have our pipeline filled up enough 3 months ago, right? And look, Will, you were in medical device sales. You got out of it, and now people look at you and go, "No, he's just a podcast host." No, you're not. You're a salesman. You're doing the exact same thing today that you did, however many years ago when you're a medical device sales rep. If you aren't feeding that pipeline consistently every single day, whether your the end of the quarter is 3 months down the road or it's 1 week down the road, you're constantly filling that funnel, that pipeline. You're going to be in deep trouble come the end of the quarter. So it starts 3 months prior. It doesn't start 1 week before the end of the quarter.
And clearly, as someone with sales leadership experience, if someone came to you and said, right, I want to hit reset on this, I'm not going to kind of totally fail my target this quarter, but it's going to be a tough quarter, but I'm going to line things up for the next 12, 18 months, 24 months by the work I'm putting in now. How, and again, I don't know the answer to this, but how would that go down with you, John? Would you go, okay, I'll cover your ass this time, but if you F this up next time round, we're going to have real words? Or do you go, my bonus is based on your bonus, so get your finger out and get it done?
No. I mean, it's absolutely. I don't, as a sales leader, I don't think that people work for me. I work for them. Um, I would not give anyone a break, though. You know, if they're coming in and they're short on their number, that's their fault, and that's something that they've got to work on. But what I would be more than happy to do is to work with them to make sure that this time next end of the sales cycle, that we're not running into the same situation. In other words, I would help them with consistency. And that's what I think what happens is, we start to fill the funnel, and then we get kind of bogged down with moving the customer through the middle of our pipeline, and we stop filling that funnel. What we have always done is we will schedule, and I do this now as a entrepreneur. I schedule time in my calendar where 2 hours every single week, usually on a Monday morning, it's my time to start working on that pipeline and filling the top of that funnel. So I don't give anybody a break. The number's the number. I don't get a break. However, I'm in the boat rowing with you.
That makes total sense, and I appreciate that. I had no idea what you were going to say then. That's I guess the answer here, or let me ask you, is the answer here total responsibility, total ownership? Is that something that we not necessarily lack in sales? Although I do know a load of moany, bitching salespeople from the previous roles I've worked at. Whereas my thought and attitude always just, to my detriment on a lot of occasions, was always just get my head down, put a kind of shield up, and just ignore whatever was coming at me and just get on with things. Can we solve a lot of our problems by just taking more responsibility for ourselves?
Yeah, I think so. And as a sales leader, a lot of that responsibility starts as early as the interview process, where you're setting realistic expectations. One of my favorite sales jobs I ever had, the vice president of sales looked at me and said, "Look, if you don't hit your number 3 months in a row, you're gone. We love you as a person. We think you're fantastic. But if you don't do that, that's just the repercussions. That's what has to happen." And I think as a sales leader, having that conversation very, very early on in their employment is essential, because it sets the expectation that, hey, your job is to hit your numbers. And that's why we have you here. So, Will, I think the whole, this all boils down to setting realistic expectations up front, and then keeping people accountable to them on the back end.
Okay, so final one on this, then we'll wrap it up. Other than sticking a couple of hours in our diary on a Monday morning to see where we're at and to kind of perhaps put a couple more hours in the diary later on in the week to do more prospecting, how can we force accountability in ourselves if we've got this far in sales, I'm somewhat of a success, but perhaps more accountability, more stringent time management would lead to even more success? How do we go about becoming more accountable to either ourselves or whoever we look up to?
I think something like your sales school is a perfect option, because I know that you're not just teaching people in the sales school; you're also keeping people accountable. So it's helping other people come in, and hold you accountable. One of the things that I talk about in the book is goal setting, and one of the things that I recommend is finding a referee. So as you set a goal, tell people about it, and then have that person referee you. And you have to check in on a weekly, semi-weekly basis and say, "Hey, I told you I was going to make this number of cold calls. This is where I'm at." And that person, their job is to not let you off the hook. So you've got to set expectations with them that you want them to help keep you accountable. That's just one way of doing it.
And I'm going to be super selfish here, because that seems like a feature that could be added to the sales school. Just a tab that says referee. Monday morning, you type in your goals, and then me or one of the team hound the shit out of you at the end of the week to see if you've done it or not. What? And this is kind of putting perhaps your sales leadership hat on as opposed to for sales people. We'll wrap up in a second. But I'm selfishly going to ask you this kind of on air. What goals should a salesperson be setting every single week that someone should be that are reasonable goals to be achieved, that someone can follow up with them, as I kind of implement this into the sales school behind the scenes over the next few months?
So I think one of my favorite ones is tracking your prospects through the sales pipeline. I think what happens is a lot of times we focus the top of the funnel, the back of the pipeline, but we don't really track the middle. It's how quickly are we moving that customer through the sales process, that I think is something that's unique. Not many people do it. It's looking at the pipeline velocity. That to me is one of my favorite tactics for managing goals in a sales organization.
And is pipeline velocity, could that be for people like me. I was going to say the visual people like me, as most people listen to this on the audio podcast. But is that if we've got 3 steps as we've outlined here, I guess the time that people spend in each one and trying to reduce that amount of time, is that what we mean by pipeline velocity?
That's correct. So if you got a pipeline and it's typically a 3-month sales process, how quickly are you moving? If it's very simple, 3 steps in that sales process, that means on average 1 month per sales process. How quickly are you getting them through there? And then maybe you can speed up one of those 3 processes, and it will drastically reduce the buying time as well as the sales process time. So that is the increased sales velocity, and that sits on the fact that you're filling the top of your funnel, the top of that pipeline, in order to move the prospects through it as quickly as possible, whether it's qualifying them or disqualifying them as a potential at the end.
Love it. I've never. There must be software that helps you with some of this, but I've never looked at that number both in medical device sales or selling the ad space here, because I know people get stuck. There's a point in the ad sales space. What I do where I'll introduce myself to people. People immediately go. Hopefully, people go, I've listened to the show. We're ripping off your show of our own podcast. Can you help us out? Obviously, that gets me on the phone call. And people go, yeah, we've had some success, no success. We've tried it. We haven't tried it with podcast advertising. Let's jump on the phone. My biggest step is those low-hanging fruit when it's not an individual like that and they go, I don't really understand what you're talking about. And I go for this education phase, typically 5 to 10 emails, and they're all custom kind of emails of me helping people understand what it is. And it's coming from a place of, most of the big sales podcasts out there, I'm involved in it some way or somehow, whether I'm a guest or I'm helping people in the marketing behind the scenes. With the bigger vendors that have podcasts, I'm kind of helping with production costs of them, the production process of them. So I can guide people multiple ways on kind of the ad buying process as opposed to just selling it. But that number, I've no idea what that number is. That number could literally be 3 months. I'm going to check this out when we wrap up later on today, John, because that's like seemingly a number that if I get rid of that's the 20% of my sales process that makes 80% of the difference if I can make that change, right?
Absolutely. And where that becomes really important too, Will, and you see this a lot of times in big organizations, is that several of those sales process steps will be dependent on somebody that's not in sales. And so where we've used this, in corporate America is if there's a bog down in step number 2 of the sales process, and that's a third party that you're relying on, it's having that data to go to their bosses and say, hey, look, your person's not doing their job. They're not getting this customer through this part of the pipeline quick enough. That's bogging down the entire system, and your person is the bottleneck. It's giving us data points to be able to convince other folks within the organization that we need to make changes or do things more effectively. And it's absolutely trackable in both Salesforce and HubSpot. You can set things up to track your pipeline velocity.
Love it. The gift that never stops giving, John, this interview, because I've got another 5 questions, but we'll wrap things up here and we'll have you back on in the not too distant future to perhaps touch on some of these. And with that, mate, I've got one final question to ask everyone that comes on the show. And that is, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling?
For me, it would be authenticity, Will. I think for a long time, I thought that I had to fit a certain corporate mold. I needed to wear certain suits. I needed to talk a certain way. And what I realized is that by not being my authentic self, I wasn't being different. I was just copying everyone else. The day that I decided I'm going to be who I am, that was the day that I saw, everything just take off for me.
And what made you realize that?
It's a long story. You want me to go to the story?
We'll touch on it in the next episode. But what's the summary? What was the moment? Was there a specific point in time when you went, oh shit, this needs to change?
Yeah. So I'm 6'2", about 240 pounds, and I'm a ginger. I got red hair, and it was the day that I realized that I wanted to call the attention to being a big redheaded sales rep that got everyone's attention, and I used big red gum as like a leave behind, and that really kind of changed the whole trajectory of my sales career.
Love it. Well, that is a tease for the next episode that we're going to record, John. And with that, mate, tell us a little bit about the book, the speaking, everything else that you're up to as well.
Yeah, if you want to get in touch with me, the best way is to go to the website, knuckle-dragging-sales.com. And I've got a bunch of free information out there. If you go to knuckle-dragging-sales.com/will, there's a ebook that you can download at no cost, and it'll show you how to set up your LinkedIn profile so that you are grabbing recruiters as well as customers' attention.
Perfect. Well, I'll link to all that over in the show notes of this episode. It'll be salesman.org/6/6 foot ginger. That's what we'll do the show notes of this episode. And with that, John, I appreciate your time, mate. I appreciate your insights. We kind of went all over the place with this one, and I appreciate that as well, because it can be quite difficult to have random questions thrown at you. You crushed it like a pro. And with that, I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Thanks, Will. It's my pleasure.